Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. I am Bill Garibaldi, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm a member of the CUIIC Education Committee and a senior project manager at MTE Consultants in Ontario. Thank you for joining us for the 8th CUIIC Academy Webinar of 2023. Geohazard management for onshore pipelines will be presented by Damian McClarty and Bob Saunders, geotechnical engineers from Thurber Engineering Limited. Damian is a geological engineer specializing in geohazard assessment and management. He has been involved in pipeline and linear projects ranging from preliminary design to the construction, inspection, mitigation, and operational management of geohazards. He has a keen interest in the development and improvement of ongoing geohazard management programs to effectively identify, prioritize, and manage geohazards based on risk. Mr. McClarty is also experienced in both desktop and field-based terrain assessments, detailed site investigations, and interpretation of remote sensing data. Bob Saunders is a senior associate and senior geotechnical engineer with Thurber Engineering and has worked in the Calgary office for over 17 years. He has a bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Calgary, a master's of geotechnical engineering from the University of Alberta, and over 40 years experience in a wide range of geotechnical projects in both Western and Northern Canada. Bob began his career in permafrost engineering and worked on several major northern pipeline projects, including the Foothills Alaska Highway Gas Pipeline, the Norman Wells Pipeline, the Mackenzie Gas Project, and the Alaska Pipeline Project. His master's project was on wheel ditcher productivity in permafrost. Mr. Saunders' main area of experience is with linear pipeline projects, specializing in geohazard assessments and trenchless crossing design. Organized by the Canadian Underground Infrastructure Innovation Centre, the University of Alberta, and Benjamin Media, CUIIC Academy offers classes, courses, webinars, and events to deliver underground infrastructure education across Canada. CUIIC Academy webinars cover a variety of pressing topics related to the underground infrastructure sector. Speakers include industry-leading professionals who provide a monthly free educational webinar to the public, followed by a question and answer period. Please join us next month on September 21st for our next installment of the CUIIC Academy Webinar Series. In addition to the series, we will be holding the CUIIC Safety Academy this November in Edmonton. For more information on the events listed, please visit cuiic.ca. I want to thank our sponsor. Thank you to M-Pipe for sponsoring the 2023 CUIIC Academy Webinar Series. Please contact Benjamin Media if you are interested in learning more about becoming a sponsor. Now, let's begin today's webinar. Bob and Damian will be answering questions following the presentation, so you can type them in at any time. Bob and Damian, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you all for attending. We hope that we can provide you with a meaningful overview of our experience with managing geohazards on linear projects, particularly focusing on pipelines. For those of you who are in the geohazard profession or work for companies with a well-established risk management system, this presentation will likely not present any earth-shattering new concepts, but hopefully we can shed some new perspective on them, some of our experiences on some of the strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully you'll learn something from it. And for those of you who are relatively new to geohazards or are involved in integrating geohazards into your company's overall risk management programs, we hope that this presentation will be useful and give you a basic framework for how the industry normally handles this. Just before Damian dives in, I'd just like to touch on, the reasons why geohazard is very important to managing linear assets. Well, firstly, and most importantly, it is good business. I mean, outages are very expensive and unwanted, and it's also just, very, very good from a perspective of the environment and for everyone involved that we don't have any issues. So, and the other driving factor is that it is also part of our regulations. So since 2019, all pipelines operating in Alberta need to consider slope movement and geohazards in their overall pipeline risk management program. And unfortunately, the guidelines that we have to follow or are recommended following are very basic and known to all of people involved in pipeline, and it's just CSA Z66219 oil and gas pipelines. And Damian will be touching on that briefly in his presentation as well. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Damian.
Great, thanks, Bob. So just to kick things off, I'm just going to start with some kind of basic high-level definitions, just so everyone's on the same page when we're using this risk terminology. And a couple key things to focus on with this slide. Mainly, the common thing that gets mixed up here is the difference between a hazard and a threat. So a hazard just being any condition with the potential for causing an undesirable consequence, and a threat being any hazard which is either currently impacting or expected to impact an element at risk. Now, the one kind of key difference, which we'll show on the next slide with our kind of model framework when we're typically dealing in a pipeline space, is we're often not talking about risk in general. We often simplify the consequence side of the equation to a uniform value so we can focus more on the initiation of a hazard or the frequency side. So that's where we use these kind of vulnerability and susceptibility terms a little bit different. So vulnerability being the probability that a given consequence will be realized if the element at risk is impacted by a hazard in question, and susceptibility being the product of the probability or likelihood that a hazard will impact the element at risk, and the vulnerability of the element at risk to the hazard in question, which, as mentioned, assumes that the consequence is uniform for the purpose of the assessment. So this is kind of the risk management model overview as presented by Mulbarrow in 2015. So here you can see he's separated risk into the probability of failure side of the equation and the consequence of failure side of the equation. And the reason we tend to separate these is quite often, like most operators will do an overarching risk assessment, which will pull in all sorts of different integrity threats, with geohazards only being one piece of that on the frequency side. So it tends to be more useful for us to deal in this frequency or susceptibility space and separate that consequence analysis. Now, the one thing I'll point out with Mulbarrow's model is he lumps all geohazards under time-independent mechanisms, and I think there are cases where you may want to treat them as more of a time-dependent option. This may be a case where, say, you've got some of these, small-scale displacements occurring year over year, maybe inches of movement when we're talking about these kind of deep-seated earth slides in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin or ongoing bank erosion. Not to say that you can't have rapid acceleration with extreme events. It's just that there is a sort of progressive nature to some of these hazards. So this is when we get into the regulatory framework. So on the left, we have the risk management process diagram from CSA Z662. So this is just to highlight that typically, as mentioned, when we're dealing with they split, if you look down at the hazard identification box, and then it separates into the frequency and consequence side of the equation. So we're typically dealing with that hazard ID and frequency analysis, and then feeding information into an overall risk assessment rather than doing an independent risk assessment for geohazards. Not in every case, just kind of typically. And then in the top right-hand side of the slide, this is kind of our typical approach to a geohazard management program. So typically we'd start at the screening level with a high-level hazard identification and inventory, and this may include a simple hazard ranking, which I'll touch on in a couple slides. And then usually we would use that initial hazard ranking to prioritize our efforts a little bit. We would, acquire some additional data, hopefully have some background information on the system that we're looking at, move into a more detailed assessment, and that detailed assessment would then, feed our actual management actions. And that's the framework that we have in the lower right. It's kind of your typical decision tree for hazard management, or in this case, I've used threat management in that process diagram because now we've identified, actual threats to the pipeline at this stage. So if you're looking at an unmanaged threat, you would typically do another round of assessment, just kind of looking at all the information that you've accumulated up to this point. If the risk or the threat is below a tolerable limit, you can accept it and move on and just ignore it. Otherwise, if you're dealing with a more progressive type hazard, you may set up a monitoring plan. Typically, if you're going to do that, you should also have some sort of a threshold that you're monitoring to so that you can intervene, so you're actually reducing risk. You can look at avoidance options, which would be either rerouting the pipeline around the hazard or drilling underneath it, something to those effects, or potentially going as far as either temporary or permanent mitigations with something like a stress relief or overall slope stabilization. So moving into kind of the screening level assessment, I'll just talk through kind of our typical preferred approach to screening based on our experience. And generally, so this is arguably the most important step of the process, so it warrants a bit of discussion here. And the reason it's so important is because it defines your effort spend, the efficiency and the effectiveness of the rest of your management program. Essentially, if you're too conservative at the screening level, you can end up having far too many hazards in your inventory, and if it just becomes unmanageable and you may not be able to effectively prioritize your spending on actually reducing risk on your critical hazards, which could be impacting your pipeline integrity. But at the same point, if you're, too light or unconservative, you could be missing critical hazards. So what we found is the most effective way to approach the screening process is typically to acquire Lidar, and this doesn't necessarily need to be Lidar specifically flown for your pipeline system. Oftentimes, existing off-the-shelf Lidar that vendors have available is sufficient. The vintage is not overly critical for the initial screening assessment, as long as the resolution is reasonable, the data quality is reasonable. The reason we focus on this so much is it's really the only tool that gives us a good sense for the bare earth morphology. What we found is that we can do screening solely off of air photos, publicly available data, some of the more historic methods, but generally we'll end up spending a similar level of effort and be left with a large deal of uncertainty in that screening assessment, and we would often need to go through and rescreen a system once Lidar was acquired. So it's more cost effective to just get the Lidar up front and have a better sense of how you're screening and ranking your hazards. Yeah. And then I'll just highlight on the right too it's just an example framework for landslide classification that was presented by Dewar in 2019. So moving into ranking, and this is the full ranking framework. So typically at a screening level, we're just dealing with the hazard ranking side of this framework, because usually we don't want to, in the initial screening process, we don't necessarily want to bring in the asset. We want to be able to have some sort of a ranking system that's independent of the asset location. And then after, once that initial screening and ranking has been completed for our assessment corridor, then you would bring in the asset attributes and look at your overall susceptibility, which is what is shown by this framework on screen. This process is just more useful for prioritizing your kind of more detailed assessment and management efforts. This also may be, your initial step in this process may be a more simplified assessment and ranking, say on a qualitative basis, and you may move to something a bit more detailed, more advanced, or more semi-quantitative once more information becomes available. And just a quick point to make here about background data is that at this stage in the process, it's often critical to start digging through any existing information you have on the pipeline system, because that can give us a lot of insight into the asset condition, or potentially any historic data that exists for the hazard, particularly if you're, say, assessing a system that's been acquired from another operator, or something that's been in operation for several years without any sort of consistent geohazard management. So the typical data sources we're concerned about here would be like as-built surveys, any inline inspection data, particularly any IMU data, instrumentation, air photos, Lidar, any previous assessments that were done, and construction or dig records. And these records can often be incomplete or disorganized or difficult to obtain, but the effort is definitely worthwhile from a management perspective. So I'll move on to talking through some of our kind of typical hazard assessment tools, and this is just kind of, we'll talk through kind of our opinions on each tool, where it fits into the toolbox, what we see as the pros and cons, how we typically apply them in a geohazard management context. So we talked a little bit about Lidar already, so I'll just touch on it here, and I will get into differential Lidar a couple slides later. But just initially, as a base data set, as mentioned, Lidar is kind of our best tool for being able to assess the superficial morphology. It does have a few things that you need to consider. The first one that I think is maybe less obvious to some people who aren't as familiar is that higher resolution Lidar is not necessarily better from a terrain assessment, geohazard interpretation perspective. What tends to happen is you can introduce more false returns. The data gets a little bit noisier. You get a bit more roughness from the vegetation. So typically we like to stay in that kind of 0.5 meter to 1 meter grid resolution. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions to that rule. That's just kind of a rule of thumb that we apply. It also makes the data sets a lot easier to manipulate from a computational perspective. Big thing to remember is that it can't penetrate snow. So your collection window does matter quite a bit. It's often best to collect in early spring or late fall when your vegetation cover is minimal and there's no snow on the ground. The collection methods can impact your data quality. In most cases, for pipeline applications, we're dealing with large swaths of Lidar, typically collected with fixed-wing aircraft. It can be collected with helicopter or drones if you need higher resolution data or you're dealing with smaller areas, but that's often a bit more expensive and, again, not necessarily adding a lot of value. And the big thing with Lidar is it doesn't give you any sort of indication of soil moisture. So we'll often pair a Lidar assessment with a review of the historical air photos so that we can kind of garnish some of that information. So yeah, the other big thing with Lidar is that how you view it matters. So what we're showing on screen is an example of a hillshade. So basically we're artificially projecting a sun direction onto the digital elevation model and then viewing how that shadow impacts the elevation. So this is typically easier for people who are less familiar with viewing Lidar, but the problem with it is that it can wash out or overemphasize certain slope aspects. So if you are viewing it this way, it's really important to first understand what your sun direction is and then manipulate it so that you're looking at it from multiple perspectives. I typically prefer to view a slope shader, which will evenly shade your DEM based on the angle of the slope. So it's a bit more consistent when highlighting features, but it becomes a little harder to interpret your topographic highs and lows. So air photos. So I'll just clarify here, when I'm making the point about screening and needing Lidar, air photos are still a really powerful assessment tool. They're just not great if we have to rely on them exclusively for screening when we have, other tools available. But, if we have the opportunity, we'll almost always look at them in conjunction with the Lidar, because generally the big benefits with air photos is that the record goes back a lot farther. So for most of Canada, we have coverage back to the 50s and 60s. You can also see a lot more information around land use changes, types of vegetation, soil moisture, potentially soil type, depending on the features that we're looking at. So there's a lot of additional information that can be gained. So while they're kind of seen as a more antiquated method, I think they still have their place in geohazard management. Like, we may not be, pulling out our stereoscopes and looking at the entire pipeline right away, but particularly once we've identified kind of a higher risk hazard, we'll want to, collect the historic air photos for that site and take a more detailed look. INSAR. So I think INSAR has definitely become a popular topic in recent years. It can provide, indications of surface movement, but it does require some interpretation. It's got a few key drawbacks, particularly when we're talking in a pipeline context. So the big things to remember with INSAR is that you are only detecting changes between pixels in the data, so it doesn't really give you any sense of morphology. And the big drawback with it, particularly in a pipeline context, is because we're often dealing with heavily vegetated right-of-ways, we're often limited to L-band INSAR data so that we can get the vegetation penetration. And currently, if you're tasking a satellite with for L-band for collection, you're often dealing with a 3 meter by 3 meter pixel. Now, in flatter areas, that's not such a big deal, but since we're most often dealing with landslides on steeper slopes, the elevation averaging that occurs over that 3 meter by 3 meter pixel can introduce quite a bit of error in the data and can make the interpretation a little bit more difficult. Now, and again, because of the vegetation, we don't have a lot of historic L-band data that's widely available currently. So you're often looking at tasking a satellite from point 0. So you may have to wait up to a year before you have enough data that you can start seeing any, measurable changes. And it's typically a bit more expensive because you're tasking a specific satellite to look at a specific slope. Most of the historical data available currently is not high enough resolution to really add much value from a geohazard assessment perspective. And then similar to LiDAR, it can't penetrate snow, and in addition, areas with really high soil moisture can cause interference in the data. So it does have some benefit in that you can, monitor a very large area. And I think as the technology progresses, we'll see this start to become a lot more useful, particularly as it gets cheaper. Right now, where we're at today, I think we generally prefer to use LiDAR with a bit of judgment in terms of assessing landslide activity just based on the morphology that we can see in the LiDAR. But I mean, in cases where you need to prove yes or no, this might be moving, the INSAR can add some value there from a business case perspective, for example, to justify spending. The other thing to note is that you can get, similar to how the hillshade in the LiDAR works, you can get shadows in the INSAR data depending on the direction the satellite's moving. So you have to be careful that just because nothing's showing up in the INSAR data doesn't mean that you're not necessarily getting either, very slow small scale displacements that may not show up in your detection window, or that you're not, overemphasizing or underemphasizing different movement aspects. Photogrammetry. So the example here shown on screen is just kind of the most basic photogrammetry application. So this is a quick 15-20 minute drone flight that's then dropped into an automated processing software. So this is obviously done without ground control, more as just a visual tool. But photogrammetry can be really useful just in the fact that it's cheap, quick, and accessible. If you do apply surveyed ground control points, you can actually get a more accurate model than LiDAR in some cases, but your big drawback is that it can't penetrate the vegetation. And then the other thing too, for this example on a construction site, any sort of moving objects can, interfere with your model surface. And then you can also have issues with improper photo settings or inadequate overlap, which can introduce errors, which you can kind of see in the lower left portion of the image, where we're kind of beyond the extent of the area that we were modeling, and you didn't have as much overlap, so you start to get a bit more distortion in the model. Survey. So I just wanted to touch on surveys because I feel like it's a tool that often gets overlooked from a geohazard management perspective, or we just treat it as kind of supplementary data. There are cases where this can be a really effective assessment tool. And quite often, like we've had a few clients that have tested out, repeat surveys with shallow monitoring pins to pick up superficial movements, and they've had fairly good correlation with other either remote sensing techniques or instrumentation installed on those slopes. So that is one option. It's often also a cost-effective option if you're dealing with smaller diameter pipelines, particularly if they're too small to run any sort of inline inspection tools. That can be an option, because sometimes if you've got a small diameter line impacted by a landslide, you may actually be able to pick up deflections in that line just off a survey. So it's can be a powerful tool. So jumping into our field reconnaissance, so I'd say aerial reconnaissance is kind of our first go-to if we're assessing a large area just for efficiency purposes. It's nice in that you can, if you're flying an entire pipeline, it gives you a bit of sense for the scale of the terrain that you're dealing with, a bit of, an overview of several of the hazards. If you are looking at doing this, we would typically recommend doing it with a helicopter over a fixed wing aircraft, just for the ability to be able to stop, hover, circle, land if you see something critical. It is important to remember that you're not going to be able to see everything from the air. You'll pick up large scale changes or obvious things like exposed soil or fresh scarps that break the vegetation lines, but you may not see, say, smaller indications of fresh movement on heavily vegetated slopes or things like that. So just it's important it's a valuable tool, but important to understand its limitations as well. And same thing goes for your typical ground reconnaissance here. So I think one thing that we've seen a lot is the ground reconnaissance can become kind of a default go-to for geohazard management, and it's almost treated like a checkbox where if someone's gone and looked at the site, you can say, yep, okay, someone's looked at it, we're good, and the management kind of stops there. And it's really important to understand that while this is a powerful assessment tool for us to be able to see the actual field conditions of the hazard, there's a lot that we can't see just by walking the slope. So, like an experienced practitioner may be able to go out there and walk the slope and say, yeah, I'm seeing, landslide features, and, I'm seeing like wet areas, things like that. But it really doesn't give us a good sense for the hazard activity in a lot of cases. This is particularly true with these kind of deep-seated earth slides in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, where we may not see superficial expression even if those slides are actively moving. So I think there needs to be a little bit of forethought put into when you're planning to go to the field for these, just to know what you're looking for. And really what you're looking for in these is any sort of really obvious signs of activity. So fresh scarps, tension cracks, indications of superficial movement such as tilted or deformed trees, bank erosion, scour, things like that can be effectively picked up. But I know we were just speaking with one of our clients the other day, and they're saying they have a paper coming out soon where they were evaluating kind of a series of their kind of most critical hazards, and only I think they were saying less than 40% of those hazards actually showed superficial indications of movement, even though they were creating a large strain demand on the pipeline. So just an important thing to be aware of. But I would still say for most, particularly our kind of higher ranked hazards, it's a good idea to make sure you're doing at least one ground assessment to walk the slope and get a sense for the field conditions. But then I think the value of repeat visits kind of needs to be evaluated rather than just treated as a default action. And I'll quickly touch on terrestrial LiDAR here. It's not used very often for pipeline applications. So a couple key things to consider. It has a max effective range of about 1 to 1.5 kilometers. The scanner needs to be placed in a stable location with a clear view of the target. The equipment's quite heavy, so it can be, hiked in, but it's not necessarily fun to do so. As the diagram on the right shows, you can introduce data shadows. And so this is a bigger deal for, say, deeper tension cracks, or if you have large trees on the slope, they can sometimes be difficult to remove from the data set. Yeah, and when comparing multiple scans, just make sure that your scanner is collected from the same location to avoid introducing errors. And if you are going out to collect this, it's often good to collect terrestrial photogrammetry as well. And this is it's generally better for steep slopes, and we're quite often dealing with shallower slopes in most of our landslide applications, not all. And the same is kind of inversely true for the aerial LiDAR. It doesn't do as well on the really steep near vertical slopes, where terrestrial might be a better option. So jumping into our differential LiDAR, I think this is one of those things, it's relatively quick and easy to do and can be valuable from that perspective. There's a few things to consider with it. And the big thing is that you're, obviously the date range of LiDAR data sets that you're comparing is the limit of your detection window. Most of the common differential comparison techniques have a detection limit kind of usually around 25 centimeters. So there may be a lot of movement that gets missed. And this is quite often because, our older data sets tend to be a lot coarser, so that can introduce errors when comparing to newer, higher resolution data. You can, if you have two really good quality data sets and you're doing a point-to-point cloud comparison, you can get more accurate than the 25 centimeters, but often we don't have that level of resolution. Just keep in mind with all the other, kind of superficial techniques we're talking about here, you're talking about detecting superficial movements, so you may not be getting a full sense of what's happening at depth in a landslide. You can have numerous potential sources of error, particularly around projection issues with the different data sets. Yeah, I think that's about it. So I'll show another example on the next slide here. So this is just kind of so you can see some common error. So this was a case of comparing two LiDAR data sets that at slightly different resolutions. You can see all the noise that shows up on the slope. And this is a slide that we know is actively moving, but the differential LiDAR didn't pick it up. It picked up some large scale changes around, construction on the right of way and erosion in the river, but not necessarily the landslide activity that we were concerned about. So just because you don't see something on differential LiDAR doesn't mean you can just completely write off a slope either. And I'll just show a quick example. This is something that we sometimes do as a quick alternative, is just to create a GIF of the two LiDAR data sets that rotates back and forth on an even interval, which can kind of help to visually highlight those changes without having to necessarily go through the actual differential computation. So moving into the instrumentation, and obviously this is a fairly big topic, so I'm just going to gloss over kind of some of the more common stuff, typically dealing with these more like the slower moving earth slides that we're often dealing with in a pipeline context, particularly here in Alberta. So we're mostly focused on inclinometers or in-place inclinometers or SAAs with nested VWPs, and then I'll just touch on strain gauges briefly as well. So these are really powerful assessment and monitoring tools for understanding hazard activity, but it is important to remember that while they're measuring, say, what the landslide is doing, they're not giving you any indication of strain demand on the pipeline. So in order for this data to really be utilized to its full potential, there's either some additional tools that need to be applied or some additional analysis that needs to be done. I think people often tend to forget that they are monitoring from the point when they are installed and not necessarily the full amount of movement that the pipeline may have experienced. So if the pipe's been in the ground for 20, 30 years, and you have 3 years of inclinometer data, you're not getting the full scale of movement that's occurred since pipeline construction. And then there's a big lag time before you can really get a sense for movement rates or hazard activity. Typically at least a year for most inclinometer readings in most landslide situations. And then we see a lot of really poorly installed instrumentation or poorly placed instrumentation, which can create problems as well. Like I've seen several that have been installed without, a proper interpretation of the morphology and movement mechanisms. So they might be too shallow. There can just be, simple like grouting issues. Casing was held from the top during installation, things like that. Then moving on to strain gauges, these can be a really great tool, and we often use them in stress reliefs. So where we'll, you excavate the pipe, like excavate around the pipe kind of before you do the full exposure of the trench, so you can monitor the pipe response during the stress relief. Same as any other instrumentation, they're monitoring from the point they were installed. Placement becomes really crucial, so you may want to kind of model where you expect your maximum strains to occur before putting them on the pipeline. And to get a full picture, they really need to be installed around the full circumference. I've seen a few applications where they'll only expose the crown of the pipe and put one on the very top and a couple on the sides, but that one on the bottom can add a lot of value as well in trying to get the full picture for the strain response. And then we'll jump over to the inertial measurement unit data. So I think currently from our experience, this is kind of your best tool to actually understand the strain demand on the pipeline, but it's important to remember that it is, it's an interpretation, so it's not an exact science. And then you're also not seeing your full strain picture when looking at IMU data. It's only giving you the bending strain. It's not giving you any indication of the axial component. But with that, you are actually measuring the pipeline's response. So it takes a bit of, as mentioned, it takes a bit of interpretation to identify ground movement signatures versus, things that can be introduced during typical construction or, just your standard form bends, things like that. But but I would argue this is kind of our best tool currently. There is an axial strain tool as well. It's a bit more expensive to run, and I'd say there's a few owners that are using it. But there's not as much experience, particularly on the consulting side, with the data, and I think it tends to introduce a lot of noise. So it's not a perfect tool, but there are options to look into. So moving on then to the management piece. So I'll just touch on this framework again. Kind of our three big boxes as we go through these management tools, from monitoring to avoidance of the hazard to mitigation. So most of the tools that we just talked about for hazard assessment can be applied in a monitoring application. I think, as I mentioned kind of near the start of the presentation, it's really important, if you're designing a monitoring plan, to understand how the hazard's impacting the pipeline, what the strain demand on the pipe is going to be, and what your operational thresholds are. And quite often, if you're working at this from a consultant's perspective, you need some collaboration with the asset owner to determine what their risk tolerances are when applying these. But a monitoring program is only really effective if you have some sort of threshold or trigger set where you take action to, and you need to make sure that the hazard that you're monitoring, that you're going to have enough time to take effective action to reduce the risk. So if you have a really rapid landslide or something, for instance, like, monitoring may not be appropriate. So there's a lot of considerations that go into designing a monitoring program. You may be applying several different techniques at once. So yeah. So I think our most common technique when we get to a case of unacceptable risk would be hazard avoidance. This is typically done either through a horizontal directional drill, in the case to get under, say, river crossings or deep-seated landslides, or it can be a reroute around the hazard entirely, or if neither of those options are feasible, you can potentially look at surface pipelines. A big thing we're seeing a lot recently is HDDs that have been designed without any sort of geohazard input and may actually be drilled into the landslide, which is, really detrimental from a strain perspective, because your connection point between your trench section and your HDD just creates a point for strain concentrations to build and drastically increases the vulnerability of the pipeline to the hazard. So it's really important, if you're looking at an HDD, to engage a geohazard professional to make sure that you're appropriately avoiding any sort of landslide hazard and potential retrogression. It's not always possible to install instrumentation in advance of an HDD to get a true sense for the depth of your landslide. So you need to be able to have a little bit of interpretation of the movement mechanism. Often we're just looking at Lidar and superficial geology and that to try and get a sense for how deep the landslide could be and where it could potentially retrogress to set that node drill zone. And then with above ground pipelines, these can be a good option. The example shown is a bit of a special design case. Typically, these would just be pipe on the ground on 4x4 timber sleepers is the simplest. They're easy to adjust, and then the pipe can freely move and isolates it from some of the landslide activity. But the regulators typically aren't a fan of these, so you often need to justify it. And the biggest concern being vandalism as soon as the pipe's exposed above ground. So then for our kind of slower moving landslide case, one option we treat this as a bit of a temporary mitigation would be a stress relief. So the goal here is basically that you're exposing, daylighting the pipeline to try and remove that load and hoping that it removes some of the strain that's been accumulated into the line and kind of extends your operational lifespan. So yeah, this is really only suitable if you've got very slow movement rates, and you may even have to do this multiple times on some pipelines. For the example shown on screen, I think this was the second one done for that pipeline, for example. And they can be quite expensive as well, depending on site access conditions and the amount of equipment needed. So yeah. And then moving on here to slope stabilization. So we don't see these as frequently in a pipeline context, just typically because it's often uneconomical to install a lot of the kind of heavy structural stabilizations. For shallower slides, you can apply, soil nailing or riprap revetments. But typically, as soon as we get into kind of the bigger, like tension soil anchors and stuff, it becomes uneconomical. Not in every case, but it is like you need a fairly special case in order to apply any of the more intensive stabilization designs. So I'll just go through some key takeaways, and then we can jump over to questions. So I think biggest points we want to make from this presentation is just that be cautious not to be overly conservative at a screening level, as it can reduce your overall program effectiveness. You really want to make sure that you're spending money on reducing your hazards that are posing the highest threat to the pipeline, rather than getting bogged down in trying to, say, inspect hundreds or thousands of sites every year. By Lidar, it's our best baseline tool to get an understanding of what hazards are present, what things we need to consider, and that's the best tool for guiding kind of your subsequent assessment and management steps. Field reconnaissance is not a checkbox, so just because someone physically looks at the site every year doesn't mean you're effectively managing your hazard or reducing your risk in any way, because they may not be able to identify ongoing ground movements that have minimal surface expression. And, even if we do identify something, we can't determine the strain on the pipeline. They're really just there as, like, if we see something big and scary and need to ring an alarm bell to take action immediately. It's not an effective long-term management tool. And yeah, same thing with traditional instrumentation, extremely helpful for assessing a hazard and determining its activity level, but it's not giving you a sense for the strain demand on the pipeline. You can somewhat interpret that by completing kind of a more detailed FEA analysis. Those are quite expensive, and if the assumptions around the landslide mechanisms are incorrect, they can introduce a lot of uncertainty. So that's where the IMU data becomes really critical, because that can actually give you a little bit of insight into the strain demand on the pipeline. So that's all I had. So I think we can move on to questions.
Perfect. If you want, I see you brought Bob back for the questions. That's great. Yep. Thanks. Okay, that was a fabulous presentation. Thanks so much to both of you. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. And we have a few right now. So the first one is, who is doing slope assessment for owners of a pipeline? Who is offering geohazard mitigation solutions? Is it contractors or geohazard specialists?
So I think this depends on the situation. Some owners have in-house geotechnical engineers and geohazard specialists that can do this themselves. Others rely more on, consultants like us to complete those assessments and provide mitigation recommendations. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else to add there, Bob?
No, I'd agree 100%. It's quite variable in terms of we often will give options as well, and as Damian indicated, sometimes things like stabilization may not be considered. Say we're dealing with a very, very deep seated landslide, and so then we would be looking at things though that are not even really fixes. There could be a reroute or the HDD, which are required. So they're all going to require different levels of investigation. We'd like to stabilize slopes when feasible. It's just as Damian indicated, it's not all slopes lend themselves to that kind of a solution though.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen. So this is a bit more of a comment from what I can see. It says also, so it's clearly someone typing while you were presenting. Also, L-band INSAR is in high demand and very difficult to procure. We've been advised of wait times of more than 1 year. So I don't know, I think maybe it's just looking for you guys to comment on that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that as much as from our end, but totally believable. So yeah, thanks for adding the comment, Vincent.
Okay, is Google Earth a reliable tool for hazard assessment?
I would say it can be in some cases, depending on the types of hazards that you're looking at. We've used it to do preliminary screening in more mountainous areas where we're dealing with kind of, larger scale hazards like debris flows and rock avalanches more prevalently. Typically, we would prefer not to use it as a sole tool for hazard assessments. It would be similar to the aerial imagery. We put it in the same category of supplemental information rather than, a single tool that you'd want to rely on.
Very good. Would you recommend that geohazard assessments be done for pipelines in urban areas? I'm thinking of the many sanitary and storm sewers that are in the areas of rivers and creeks.
I'll jump in on this one. Absolutely. In fact, you should be looking at them with more scrutiny. I think they get overlooked. Sometimes we get lulled into thinking that there's no hazards in the cities, and that's incorrect. So yeah, and to bear in mind, I mean, as Damian said, we typically when we're looking at a whole system, we're normalizing it for a failure. But there's actually it's more complicated than that. You obviously, when you're doing a full risk management, you have to look at the full consequences. So density of population, all those things are factoring into when an operator needs to act on something. So it's just going to matter in terms of things like sanitary and storm pipelines. I mean, those. It's the economic consequence or the outage to all these people that factors. So it's quite a bit different than a gas pipeline, which could cause a immediate loss of life. There can be other things associated with this that are just so the consequences are going to be quite different. But yeah, don't forget the urban ones for sure. And in fact, like as indicating, they may require higher standards, and oftentimes we're talking about it in gas pipelines is running with a thicker wall thicknesses in urban areas.
Very good. Anything to add, Damian?
No, I think that was good.
Very good. When would you use INSAR versus differential Lidar?
So I think this usually comes down to a couple things. The big factors being cost and then your potential detection window. So usually if we have like an older Lidar data set available, we would lean towards differential Lidar, even if we were collecting a newer set to compare to. If there were issues with the older LiDAR data set, or it was, it didn't exist or was incomplete, something like that, then, completing the differential INSAR may end up being cheaper. So yeah, it's kind of a case by case basis, but usually just economics more than anything overly technical.
Very good. How accurate have you seen MIU data? I've seen Z values off during a lot of pig runs, even though AGMs are set about 2 miles apart.
Yeah, we've seen variable accuracy in IMU data. I mean, often when we're looking at bending strain, we're more concerned about relative strain changes than necessarily a precise value. We have seen centimeter level accuracy. We've also seen runs where the pig was advanced too quickly through the pipe, and they've had data issues, and we've had to rerun data. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. For stress relief mitigation, can you comment on excavating recommendation?
Yeah.
For example, top to bottom, when would you recommend bottom up or start mid slope?
Yeah, and I think there was another one from Kevin on stress reliefs here about whether you allow the pipe to spring back naturally or pull it back into the original alignment. So I can touch on both. So usually you have to consider how the pipe is being loaded when you're determining your excavation plan. So for example, in most cases, if you have a pipe that's being axially loaded, if it's parallel to the landslide, you'd want to excavate top to bottom, so that you're kind of slowly reducing that load and monitoring your response. I haven't had any experience with pulling a pipe back into the original alignment. Most of the operators I've talked to prefer to allow it to spring back naturally, just so that you're not potentially damaging the pipe by overstraining it back in the opposite direction or anything along those lines. But yeah, not exactly my area of expertise, but yeah.
In the old days, we did pick them up and sling them, but I think it's frowned upon now because you really don't know if you're doing damage. So,
okay, are LiDAR inventories free in Canada?
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob. You're more familiar.
I was just going to say, there is a very spotty coverage of free LiDAR. The good news is like BC is going to make a major initiative to provide all the LiDAR they're collecting free. But right now there are certain areas in Alberta where we do have really good coverage around Grand Prairie. They make their information available. Edmonton has a coarser, I think a 2-meter one. City of Calgary has a 2-meter one that's free. So it's becoming more common, but it's not like in the States right now where it's pretty widespread. So we're getting there, but it's slow.
Okay, thanks. Now this next question here, I'm not exactly sure what it's getting at. Does Geohazard any classification, for example, low risk, medium risk, or high risk?
I think I'll try and answer this in a more general sense. So typically when you're doing these assessments, like you would define, like typically whoever's doing the assessment would define the risk classifications for that assessment, because depending on kind of the level of detail that we're looking at, the amount of information we had, we may do a simple, like 3x3 risk or threat matrix where we're just dealing with like low, moderate, high as your example, or if we need a little bit more granularity, we may do a 5x5 introducing very low, very high, so that we can start to differentiate the suite of hazards that we're seeing. So it's kind of determined on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, next question. Have you seen an increase in demand from pipeline owners and operators in the U.S. requesting geohazard assessments of their facilities and structures? Or have you seen more RFPs coming up?
Yeah, we primarily work in Canada, but I think in general there has been a large increase in demand recently as this, these kind of issues get a bit more exposure. There were a few years ago there was a series of failures in the U.S. which really drove up the demand for assessments and mitigations there. We just haven't been as personally involved in it.
Okay, that person questioning also mentioned great presentation, guys.
Thanks.
Do you have recommendations for prioritization of seismic hazard assessments at watercourse crossings? Although we generally screen the sites using terrain mapping and seismic hazard maps, our consultants generally recommend conducting borehole investigations to confirm the presence of liquefiable soils at depth, sometimes followed by soil type modeling, which tends to be fairly costly.
Yeah, I think you can do a certain amount of prioritization off of terrain mapping, just understanding what soil types are potentially present. But I mean, in a lot of cases, you're going to need that borehole information to really confirm what's down at depth, because usually even for a detailed terrain mapping exercise, we can only really interpret the upper 3 meters of soil. So I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that, Bob?
Just that we don't really have a good sense for the density of the deposit. So
yeah, that too.
So I mean, we might think that there's a bunch of sand there, but we don't have any idea whether it's going to liquefy or it's very dense. So it's hard to get around. I think you can only go so far, and I think there's certain things that could be screened out. Really looking at the height of your banks and things like that. But for most cases, probably you're going to need some kind of a ground truthing.
Okay, well, we have made perfect time here. We've come to the end of the questions, and we've just got enough time to sign off here. So first of all, I want to thank both Damian and Bob and Thurber Engineering for the presentation today. You guys were great. I'd also like to thank Alicia Such from CUIIC, Megan Squires from Benjamin Media, and also the CUIIC Education Committee for organizing the CUIIC Academy Webinar Series and the other events that the CUIIC Education Committee helps with. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our CUIIC members. You can see them listed on this screen here. This is, of course, the members by company, but there's a lot more individuals involved with each of those companies, of course, and it brings a lot of power to the table when we're putting together events and trying to understand research needs. And finally, of course, thank you to you for all attending today's session and for your support of the Canadian Underground Infrastructure Innovation Centre. I hope you all have a great day. Bye for now.